The grand ballroom of the Blackthorn Palace glittered like a constellation brought to earth. Thousands of candles reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers that hung from vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient wolf battles. Lena Harper moved through the crowd like a shadow, her simple gray servant's dress, a stark contrast to the jewel-toned gowns and elaborate suits worn by the noble wolves who filled the space. She carried a silver tray laden with crystal flutes of champagne. Her eyes downcast as she'd been taught since childhood. An Omega in a world ruled by Alphas learned quickly that invisibility was survival. The annual Moonrise Gala was the most important event in the werewolf social calendar, where the most powerful packs from across the kingdom gathered to demonstrate their wealth and influence. Lena had worked in the palace for 3 years, ever since her parents died, and left her with nothing but debts and a low-born bloodline that marked her as expendable. She'd scrubbed floors, washed linens, and served at countless events, always careful to blend into the background, to never draw attention to the fact that she existed at all. But tonight, fate had other plans. Lena was navigating through a particularly dense cluster of young nobles near the marble fountain when someone's foot shot out deliberately in her path. She stumbled, managing to keep the tray balanced through sheer desperation, but the momentum carried her forward directly into the path. Of Lord Castellan's son, Marcus. He was everything the wolf nobility prided themselves on being, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of classical features that came from generations of selective breeding, his alpha status radiating from him like heat. He also had a reputation for cruelty that even other nobles whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Marcus caught her shoulder to steady her, and for one brief moment, Lena thought perhaps he meant to help. Then his grip tightened painfully, and his lips curved into a smile that made her blood run cold. Before she could react, he yanked hard on the neckline of her dress, and the cheap fabric that was all a servant could afford simply gave way with a horrible tearing sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent ballroom. The dress didn't just tear, it practically disintegrated, the threadbare material splitting down the front and falling away, to leave Lena standing in nothing but her thin underthings in. Front of what felt like the entire kingdom. For a frozen moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there as hot shame flooded through her body and turned her face scarlet. Then Marcus started laughing, a rich, cruel sound that was immediately picked up by his circle of friends. Within seconds, dozens of nobles were laughing, pointing, making crude jokes that Lena's mind refused to process, even as tears began streaming down her face. She tried to cover herself. With her arms, tried to pick up the remnants of her dress, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't manage it. The tray had fallen, crystal shattering across the marble floor in a sound like breaking bones. Champagne spreading in a golden pool that reflected the candlelight and Lena's own destroyed reflection. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, but her legs wouldn't work. All she could do was stand there while Marcus continued his performance, bowing mockingly to the crowd as if he'd done something clever rather than something unspeakably cruel. He turned back to Lena with that awful smile still on his face, clearly preparing to deliver some final humiliating comment that would be the talk of the court for months. But before he could speak, The laughter died as suddenly as if someone had cut all their throats at once. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and Lena felt, rather than saw, every person in the ballroom turned their attention to something behind her. Even through her haze of humiliation and tears, she recognized the feeling, the electric charge in the air that meant an alpha of truly devastating power had entered the space. Not just any alpha. The Alpha King himself. Darius Blackthorn was a figure of legend even among werewolves. A warrior king who had united the fractured packs through a combination of strategic brilliance and raw dominance that left no room for challenge. He was barely 30, but had ruled for 7 years with an iron fist that most of the kingdom feared, and all of it respected. Lena had seen him from a distance during her time at the palace, had felt the weight of his presence like a physical thing whenever he passed through the servant corridors, but she'd never been this close to him before. She could feel him now, though, even with her back turned, could feel the intensity of his focus, like standing too near a fire. The crowd parted silently. As he walked forward, nobles pressing themselves against walls and columns to clear a path, their earlier amusement replaced by something that looked a lot like terror. Lena still couldn't make herself move, couldn't even make herself turn around. Just stood there, trembling and crying and wishing she could die right there on the ballroom floor. Then she felt warmth, heavy and soft, settling across her shoulders. It took her several seconds to realize it was a cloak, and several more, too. Understand that it wasn't just any cloak, but the ceremonial mantle that the Alpha King wore during formal events. Deep, midnight blue velvet, lined with silver silk, and embroidered with the Blackthorn pack crest, in threads that actually contained silver, and had probably cost more than Lena would earn in her entire lifetime. The cloak was huge on her, falling past her knees and pooling on the floor around her feet. But it was warm, and it covered her completely, and she grabbed at it with shaking. Hands like it was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. She finally managed to turn her head, to look up, and found herself staring into eyes that were the pale gold of old amber, set in a face that was all harsh angles and sharp edges. Darius Blackthorn was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read, something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't kindness either, something intense and focused that made her feel like she was the only person in the entire ballroom. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more supernatural romance content. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below telling me what you think the Alpha King should do to Marcus, because this is just getting started. Then, while Lena watched in complete disbelief, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, the man who had conquered rival packs and crushed rebellions without mercy, lowered himself into a formal bow before her. Not a slight nod of acknowledgement, but a full, deep bow of the kind that was reserved for equals or superiors, the kind that indicated profound respect. The gesture sent a shockwave through the ballroom that was almost audible, gasps and whispers rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. An Alpha King did not bow, ever, to anyone. The entire hierarchy of wolf society was built on dominance and submission, on the understanding that those at the top commanded absolute respect from those. below. What Darius had just done violated every rule of their world so fundamentally that several older nobles looked like they might actually faint. Marcus had gone from smug to gray in the span of a heartbeat, his earlier bravado evaporating as he realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Darius straightened slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom, without him having to raise it at all. There was power in that voice, the kind of deep resonance that made it clear this was someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He didn't look at Lena as he spoke. Instead, his gaze fixed on Marcus with the kind of attention a predator gives prey right before the kill. You found it amusing to assault and humiliate someone under my roof, under my protection, during an event meant to celebrate the unity of our kingdom. You chose to demonstrate your status by destroying the dignity of someone who could not fight back. Tell me, Marcus Castellan. Does this make you feel powerful? Does the laughter of sycophants and cowards fill whatever empty place exists where your honor should be? The words were delivered without heat, without obvious anger, which somehow made them infinitely more terrifying. Darius sounded almost curious, like he was genuinely interested in understanding the psychology of the pathetic creature in front of him. Marcus tried to stammer out some kind of response, something about it being a joke, about not meaning any. Real harm. But Darius cut him off with a slight gesture that made the younger man's mouth snap shut like he'd been physically struck. A joke, Darius repeated, his tone making it clear exactly what he thought of that excuse. Let me share something with you, Marcus, and with everyone else in this room who thinks cruelty is entertainment. This woman, whose name you didn't bother to learn before you decided to make her your victim, works harder in a single day than most of you have worked in your entire lives. She serves you food, cleans up after your messes, ensures your comfort, all while being paid barely enough to survive and treated as if she's invisible. She contributes more value to this kingdom than half the nobles in this room who live off inherited wealth and accomplish nothing except consuming resources that could be better used elsewhere. And when she stumbled because someone deliberately tripped her, your first instinct was to compound her misfortune by violating her in the most public way possible. The silence in the ballroom had become oppressive, heavy enough to feel like a physical weight. Lena could see some of the nobles looking distinctly uncomfortable now, perhaps wondering if their own casual cruelties might be called into question next. Darius continued, his gaze never leaving Marcus even as his words addressed the room at large. We call ourselves the superior beings, the apex predators, the rulers of both human and natural worlds. We build our entire society on concepts of strength and honor and the supposed natural hierarchy that justifies our dominance. But strength without honor is just brutality, and power without compassion is just tyranny. What I witnessed tonight was not strength, it was cowardice. It takes no courage to attack someone weaker than yourself, no skill to humiliate someone who has no means of retaliation. A true alpha protects those under his care. A true leader lifts others up rather than tearing them down to feel superior. Apparently, these are lessons some of you never learned. Darius finally shifted his attention away from Marcus, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor, and back to Lena. She was still clutching his cloak around herself, still trembling, But something in his expression made her lift her chin slightly, made her meet his eyes even though everything in her upbringing screamed that Omegas didn't make eye contact with Alphas, and especially not with the Alpha King. There was something in those golden eyes that she hadn't expected. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw in her something that no one else had ever bothered to look for. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice had gentled slightly, lost some of that edge that had been there when he was eviscerating Marcus. The question caught her off guard enough that she almost forgot to answer. "Lena," she managed, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Lena Harper, Your Majesty." Darius nodded as if she'd given him some crucial piece of information rather than just a name. "Lena Harper," he repeated, and somehow hearing her full name spoken in that commanding voice made it sound important, made her feel like maybe she was a person rather than just a convenient target. "You are under my personal protection now, effective immediately. You will be moved from the servant quarters to rooms in the west wing of the palace. You will be provided with appropriate clothing and resources. Anyone who offers you insult or harm will answer directly to me, and I promise you that my justice will be swift and absolute. Do you understand?" Lena could only nod, too overwhelmed to form words. She didn't understand. Not really. Had no idea why the Alpha King would care about a nobody Omega servant. But she understood enough to know that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to predict. Darius turned back to the crowd, his expression hardening again into something that made even the most powerful alphas in the room look away. "As for you, Marcus Castellan, you and your family are banished from court, effective immediately. You will have until dawn to remove yourselves from the capital. If you or any member of your house are found within 50 miles of this palace after sunrise, I will consider it an act of aggression against the crown and respond accordingly. Your father's lands and titles will be reviewed for redistribution to families who understand what nobility actually means. Consider yourself fortunate that I'm in a merciful mood tonight. In earlier times, what you did would have cost you considerably more than your social standing." The judgment was delivered in that same calm, almost conversational tone, but no one in the ballroom doubted for a second that Darius meant every word. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, to appeal, to do something to save his family's reputation, but one look at the Alpha King's face made it clear that ship had sailed. He bowed stiffly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury and humiliation, then turned and fled the ballroom with what remained of his dignity. The gala didn't exactly resume after that, but it limped forward in a subdued fashion as nobles tried to process what they'd just witnessed and recalibrate their understanding of what the Alpha King considered important. Darius gestured to one of his personal guards, a tall woman with sharp features and an expression that suggested she'd killed people and lost no sleep over it. "Escort Miss Harper to the West Wing and ensure she has everything she needs. If anyone attempts to interfere or asks questions they shouldn't, you have my permission to be creative in your responses." The guard, whose name Lena would later learn was Captain Celine, bowed crisply and moved to Lena's side with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her warrior's bearing. "Come with me, miss," she said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." Lena, followed numbly, still wrapped in the Alpha King's cloak, still trying to understand how her worst night had somehow transformed into something she couldn't quite name. The west wing of the palace was a place Lena had only seen from a distance, reserved for high-ranking guests and members of the royal household. The room Captain Celine led her to was larger than the entire servant dormitory where Lena had been living, with a massive four-poster bed, its own bathroom with a soaking tub that looked like it could fit 3 people, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Someone had already laid out several dresses on the bed, all in rich fabrics and flattering cuts that were nothing like the shapeless servant uniforms Lena was accustomed to. There were also undergarments, nightclothes, toiletries, even jewelry in a carved wooden box on the vanity. It was like stepping into someone else's life, into a dream that felt too elaborate to be real. Captain Celine helped her out of the ceremonial cloak with a care that suggested she understood how overwhelming this all was, then gave Lena a surprisingly kind smile. "The king wants you to know that this isn't charity, and it isn't pity. He recognizes value when he sees it, and he doesn't make gestures like the one he made tonight without good reason. Get some rest. Someone will bring you breakfast in the morning, and then we'll figure out what comes next." Lena spent that night alternating between soaking in the enormous tub, trying on dresses that all fit her perfectly, despite no one having taken her measurements, and staring out the windows at the moonlit gardens while trying to process everything that had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's cruel smile, felt the horrible moment of her dress tearing, experienced again that crushing wave of humiliation and helplessness. But then she also remembered the weight of the cloak settling over her shoulders, the sight of the most powerful man in the kingdom bowing to her as if she mattered, the sound of his voice declaring that she was under his protection. She'd spent her entire life being invisible, being nothing, being the kind of person that people like Marcus could destroy for entertainment without consequence. In the span of minutes, she'd gone from invisible to the center of attention, from victim to someone the Alpha King himself had deemed worthy of protection. She didn't understand it, didn't understand why. He'd cared. Why he'd chosen that particular moment to make that particular stand. Why she was now sleeping in luxury that felt like it belonged to someone else. What Lena didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that Darius Blackthorne had his own reasons for what he'd done. He'd been watching the gala from the second-floor balcony, a place where he could observe his court without being observed himself, when he'd seen the incident unfold. He'd seen Marcus trip Lena deliberately, had seen the dress. Tear had felt something dark and furious ignite in his chest at the sight of her standing there so vulnerable while his nobles laughed. But more than that, in the moment when Lena had first stumbled and their eyes had met for just an instant across the crowded ballroom, Darius had felt something he'd never experienced before. A pull, sharp and undeniable, like a hook lodged directly in his sternum. Recognition on a level that went beyond sight or sound or conscious thought. His wolf, the primal. Force that lived beneath his human skin had recognized her as something essential, something that belonged to him in a way that transcended reason or social hierarchy. Mate. The word had echoed through his consciousness with absolute certainty. This Omega servant, This woman, whose name he hadn't even known, was his fated mate. The concept of true mates was rare even among werewolves, something that happened maybe once in a generation, a bond so profound that it superseded all other connections. And considerations. Darius had never expected to find his mate. Most alphas of his status entered political marriages designed to consolidate power, producing heirs through obligation rather than genuine connection. He'd resigned himself to that fate years ago, had accepted that whatever capacity he'd once had for softer emotions had been burned away by the brutality required to claim and hold his throne. Then he'd locked eyes with a trembling Omega servant and felt his entire understanding of the world shift on its axis. The mate bond was supposed to be mutual, something both parties felt instantly, but Darius could tell from Lena's reaction that she hadn't felt it. Whether that was because she was too overwhelmed by trauma to register the sensation, or because the bond was somehow blocked on her end, he couldn't be sure. What he knew was that he couldn't claim her, couldn't tell her what she was to him, not when she was vulnerable and dependent, and had no real choice in the matter. So he'd done what he could. He'd protected her in the most public way possible, had made it clear that she was under his personal protection, had given her resources and safety, and the space to recover from what Marcus had done. If the mate bond was real and meant to be, it would manifest in time. If not, well, at least he'd prevented an innocent woman from being destroyed by the casual cruelty of his court. It was more complicated than that, of course. Everything in Darius's life was complicated. He ruled a kingdom that was barely holding together, where centuries-old prejudices and power structures created constant tension that threatened to explode into civil war. The hierarchy that placed alphas at the top, betas in the middle, and omegas at the bottom wasn't just social convention. It was practically religious doctrine, enforced by tradition and law, and the kind of ingrained belief that made questioning it feel like heresy. By elevating Lena so publicly, by showing her respect that many would argue she hadn't earned according to the rules of their society, Darius had opened a crack in the foundation of that hierarchy. Some would see it as weakness. Others would see it as the beginning of something they needed to destroy before it spread. Darius stood in his private chambers, the same ones his father and grandfather had occupied before him, staring at the ceremonial cloak that had been returned to him by a servant. It still carried Lena's scent, something soft, and subtle beneath the fear and distress, something that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin. He'd built his entire rule on the principle of absolute strength, had crushed challenges and rebellions with ruthless efficiency, had made the kingdom fear him, because fear was the only thing that kept the fragile peace from shattering. Now he'd shown vulnerability, had revealed that something could make him act outside the cold calculation that usually governed his decisions. His enemies would probe that weakness, would try to use Lena against him, would attempt to turn his one genuine impulse toward compassion into the blade that ended his reign. He should regret it, should wish he'd stayed on the balcony, kept his distance, let events unfold without interference the way he'd done countless times before. But every time he tried to summon that regret, all he could see was Lena's face, tear-streaked and terrified, and he knew he'd do it all again without hesitation. Make sure to Drop a comment telling me what you think about the Alpha King's actions. Was it romantic? Or does he have ulterior motives? Let me know what you think is going to happen next, because this story has so many twists coming your way. The next morning, Lena woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to cover, and a moment of complete disorientation before the previous night came flooding back. She half expected to find herself back in the servant dormitory, for everything to have been. Some elaborate stress-induced hallucination, but the enormous bed and luxurious room confirmed that it had all actually happened. A soft knock at the door preceded Captain Celine entering with a breakfast tray that held more food than Lena usually ate in 2 days. "The king requests your presence in his private study at noon," Celine said, setting the tray on a small table near the windows. "It's not a command," she added quickly, seeing Lena's expression. "If you're not ready, he'll understand. But I think it would be good for you to talk to him. He's not what you probably think he is." Lena nodded slowly, picking at a pastry that tasted like butter and honey, and some spice she couldn't identify. "What is he like?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Really, I mean. Everyone says he's ruthless and cold and only cares about power. But last night he was." "Different," Celine finished, settling into a chair with the ease of someone who'd been given permission to be informal. He was different. "Look, I've served King Darius for 5 years. I've seen him make decisions that haunted him, execute judgments that needed to be made but cost him pieces of his humanity. He's hard because the kingdom requires hardness. If he showed weakness, if he hesitated or showed mercy at the wrong times, there are a dozen alpha lords who would use it as an opening to challenge him. Everything he does is calculated to maintain the stability that keeps us from descending into the kind of civil war that killed thousands in his grandfather's time. But underneath that, underneath the reputation and the carefully maintained image, he's still a man who believes in justice and hates watching the powerful abuse the vulnerable. What you saw last night was the person he wishes he could be all the time. He just usually can't afford to show it." Lena absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the terrifying figure of legend with the man who'd bowed to her in front of his entire court. She spent the morning bathing again, this time properly, then trying on dresses until she found one that felt right. A deep green that brought out colors in her eyes she'd never noticed before. Someone, probably Celine, had left cosmetics on the vanity, and Lena applied them with hands that shook only slightly. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked so different physically, though the dress and makeup certainly helped, but because there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of something that might have been hope, or might have been defiance, or might have been the first stirring of self-worth that she'd thought had been beaten out of her years ago. The private study turned out to be a surprisingly comfortable room, lined with bookshelves and featuring deep leather chairs positioned near a fireplace that crackled with a low fire, despite the summer warmth outside. Darius was standing by the windows when Celine showed Lena in, his back to the door, wearing simple clothes rather than the formal regalia from the previous night. He looked younger somehow, less intimidating, though Lena could still feel the power radiating from him, like heat from a furnace. He turned when they entered, and Lena saw his eyes widen slightly before his expression smoothed back into neutrality. "Thank you, Selene," he said quietly. "That will be all." The captain bowed and withdrew, leaving Lena alone with the Alpha King for the first time since he'd transformed her life in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Please, sit," Darius said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Would you like tea? Coffee? Something stronger?" His tone was gentle, almost careful, so different from the commanding voice he'd used in the ballroom that Lena felt some of her tension ease slightly. "Tea would be nice," she said, settling into the chair and watching as Darius poured from a service that had been set up on a side table. He moved. With economical grace, the kind that came from extensive combat training, but there was something almost domestic about watching him prepare tea. He handed her a cup, then took the chair across from her, rather than positioning himself behind the desk in a display of authority. For a long moment, they just sat there, sipping tea in silence, while Lena tried to figure out what she was supposed to say to someone who'd saved her from humiliation, but was also literally the most powerful and dangerous. Person in the kingdom. Darius spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. "I want to apologize for putting you in an uncomfortable position last night. I acted on instinct, without considering how my actions might affect you beyond the immediate situation. You've been thrust into palace politics and court attention that you didn't ask for and have no preparation for handling. If you want to return to your previous position, if this is all too much, I'll make arrangements. You won't lose my protection. But you also won't be forced to live a life you didn't choose." The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to what Lena had assumed about how kings operated, that she could only stare at him for several seconds. "You'd really let me go back," she said slowly. "Just like that. After everything you did last night. After making such a public statement." Darius met her eyes steadily. And again Lena felt that strange pull, that sense of recognition that she couldn't quite explain. "Yes," he said simply. "I would. Because what I did was meant to protect you, not trap you in a different kind of cage. You've had enough people making decisions about your life without your consent." Something in Lena's chest twisted at that, at the casual acknowledgement that her consent mattered, that her choices were hers to make. She thought about the servant dormitory, about years of being invisible and exhausted and treated as less than human by people who considered themselves her betters. She thought about Marcus's laugh and the sound of tearing fabric and the crushing weight of humiliation that had almost broken her. Then she thought about the weight of the cloak on her shoulders, about Darius's bow, about waking up in a beautiful room where no one was going to hurt her. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, or how to be whoever you think I am, but I don't want to go back to being invisible. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being the person." "Everyone else decided I should be based on factors I couldn't control. If you're offering me a chance to be something different, then I want to take it, even if I fail, even if I'm not strong enough or smart enough or whatever enough. I want to try." Darius's expression shifted into something that might have been relief, or might have been approval, or might have been something more complicated that Lena didn't have words for. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "What you endured last night." would have broken many people who consider themselves powerful. You stood there and took it, and didn't collapse even when you had every right to. That's not weakness, Lena. That's survival, and survival is its own kind of strength. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I didn't just act on instinct last night. Well, I did. But there was more to it than simple compassion. I've been watching my court for years, watching the way the hierarchy we've built allows certain people to treat others as disposable. It's not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. We're a kingdom of wolves, yes, but wolves are pack animals. We're supposed to take care of each other, protect the vulnerable members, ensure everyone has a role and purpose. Instead, we've created a system where a tiny minority hoards all resources and power, while the majority struggles just to survive. That's not a sustainable model. It's not even a particularly stable one. Eventually, the oppressed rise up, or the system collapses under its own weight, or outside forces exploit the internal weaknesses we've created. He leaned forward slightly, intensity burning in those golden eyes. I want to change that. Have wanted to for years, but couldn't figure out how without triggering the civil war I've been trying to prevent. The noble families have too much power, too much invested in maintaining the status quo. If I try to change things by decree, they'll rebel, and we'll end up with exactly the bloodbath. I've been avoiding. But what if change came from demonstrating a different model rather than mandating it? What if people saw that treating others with dignity and respect, regardless of their designation, actually makes us stronger rather than weaker? You, Lena Harper, are not just someone I'm protecting. You're the beginning of a different kind of kingdom. If I'm right, if you're as strong as I think you are, then you might be the catalyst that transforms everything. The weight of what he was. Saying settled over Lena like a physical thing. He wasn't just offering her safety or even opportunity. He was offering her purpose, a chance to be part of something larger than herself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But why me? She asked. There must be dozens of Omegas in the palace, hundreds throughout the kingdom. What made you choose this moment, this particular situation, to make your stand? For a moment, Darius looked like he might not answer, his expression closing. Off into something unreadable. Then he seemed to come to some decision, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he leaned back in his chair. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure myself. There was something about seeing you in that moment, seeing your dignity even in the midst of humiliation, that made me unable to look away. Most people in your position would have run, would have collapsed, would have done something to make themselves smaller in hopes of escaping attention. You just stood there and took. It, and there was something in your eyes that looked like defiance, even through the tears. Like some part of you was refusing to be broken, even when everything else was being stripped away. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look suddenly younger and more human. And maybe I saw myself in that moment, saw what it feels like to be exposed and vulnerable, while people who should know better treat it as entertainment. I've spent 7 years building walls around myself, becoming the kind of king this kingdom needs, even when it meant sacrificing the person I wanted to be. Last night, I looked at you and remembered what it felt like to be human, rather than just a symbol of power. So I acted, consequences be damned, and now we're both living with the results of that decision. The admission was more honest than Lena had expected, more vulnerable than she'd thought someone like him capable of being. It made him real in a way he hadn't been before, transformed him from distant, figure of legend into an actual person with doubts and complications and reasons for the choices he made. They talked for hours after that, the conversation ranging from practical matters like what Lena's role in the palace would be to deeper discussions about the nature of power and justice and how societies change. Darius explained that he wanted her to serve as something between an advisor and a representative, someone who could provide perspective from outside the noble bubble and help him. Understand how his policies actually affected the people they were meant to serve. It wasn't a position that officially existed in the court hierarchy, which meant it would be controversial, but that was rather the point. He needed to demonstrate that value came from character and capability rather than bloodline and designation. Lena listened and absorbed and asked questions that seemed to surprise him with their insight. She'd spent years invisible, which meant she'd spent years watching and learning and understanding the way power actually flowed through the palace. She knew which nobles were actually competent versus which ones relied on inherited status. She knew which policies worked and which ones created problems that servants had to solve. She had information that Darius had never been able to access because people changed their behavior when the king was watching. If you're loving this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And please share your thoughts in the comments because I love reading your reactions and theories about where this is all headed. Over the following weeks, Lena discovered that her new position was both more interesting and more difficult than she'd anticipated. Darius included her in meetings with various officials and nobles, introducing her simply as his advisor without explanation or apology. The reactions ranged from barely concealed contempt to cautious curiosity to outright hostility. Several older nobles made their displeasure known through subtle insults and deliberate slights that would have destroyed Lena a month earlier. But something had changed in her that night in the ballroom, or maybe it had always been there, and she just hadn't had permission to let it show. She met the contempt with calm dignity, answered the challenges with intelligence that clearly surprised people who'd assumed Omegas were naturally less capable, and slowly began to carve out a space for herself in a world that didn't want her there. Darius watched her navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with something that looked like pride mixed with concern. He was careful to maintain professional distance in public, never showing favoritism that might undermine her credibility or suggest she was simply his mistress given a fancy title. But in private, during their evening meetings in his study, the walls came down. They talked about everything from policy minutiae to personal. History to the philosophy of leadership. Lena learned that Darius had claimed the throne after his father's assassination, had spent his first year putting down 3 separate rebellions, had made choices he still had nightmares about because they'd been necessary but not right. He carried the weight of his kingdom like a physical burden, and Lena found herself wanting to help shoulder it even though she had no idea how someone like her could actually help someone like him. What she didn't fully realize was that she already was helping, just by being someone he could be honest with. Darius had spent 7 years surrounded by people who either feared him or wanted something from him, who calculated every interaction based on political advantage and personal gain. Lena wanted nothing from him except the chance to be useful, to matter, to prove that she was more than the designation she'd been born into. That honesty, that lack of hidden agenda, was more valuable than she knew. It gave Darius a space where he could stop being the Alpha King and just be a man trying to figure out how to do right by people who depended on him. It gave him someone whose judgment he could trust, because she had no reason to lie to him about what she thought or observed. And slowly, carefully, it gave him something he'd never expected to have. Hope that maybe he didn't have to do this alone. For Lena's part, she was discovering capabilities she'd never known she possessed. When she spoke in meetings, offering perspectives from the servant class that had never been considered in policy discussions, she found that she had a talent for seeing connections others missed. When she mediated disputes between nobles and commoners, she discovered an intuitive understanding of what people actually wanted versus what they claimed to want. And strangest of all, she started experiencing moments where she just knew things about people, could sense when someone was lying or hiding their true intentions. It started as a vague feeling, easy to dismiss as intuition or anxiety, but it grew stronger and more specific over time. She'd look at someone and suddenly know that they were planning betrayal, or that they were genuinely loyal despite appearances, or that they carried secrets that would destroy them if revealed. She mentioned it to Darius one evening, half expecting him to dismiss it as stress or imagination. Instead, he went very still, his expression shifting into something she couldn't read. "Describe exactly what you feel when this happens," he said quietly. "Tell me everything, no matter how strange it seems." So Lena did, explaining the sensations that accompanied her insights, the way truth and lies felt different on some level she couldn't quite articulate. When she finished, Darius was staring at her with an intensity that made her nervous. "You have truth sense," he said finally. "It's incredibly rare, a gift that maybe 1 Omega in 10,000 possesses. It's a form of enhanced empathy combined with the ability to detect deception through micro-expressions and pheromone shifts that most wolves can't consciously perceive. It's also something that would have made you extremely valuable to powerful people if anyone had known you possessed it. No wonder you survived as long as you did in the servant quarters. You were instinctively avoiding people who would have hurt you and gravitating toward those who were safe." The revelation was startling, but it also made a strange kind of sense. Lena had always been good at reading people, at knowing who to avoid and who might show her small kindnesses. She'd thought it was just survival instinct, but maybe it had been something more. "This changes things," Darius said, already thinking several steps ahead. "If you can detect lies and true intentions, you're not just an advisor. You're a living truth detector in a court where half the nobles are plotting something at any given moment. We need to train this ability." "Help you control it and understand it. But we also need to keep it secret. If people know you can sense lies, they'll either avoid you or find ways to manipulate what you perceive. This has to be information we keep between us and a very small circle of trusted people." Training her truth sense became another item on Lena's increasingly complicated schedule. Darius brought in an elderly Omega woman named Mara, who also possessed the gift, though hers had weakened with age. Mara explained that truth sense was tied to emotional state and physical health, that stress and trauma could block it or make it unreliable. She taught Lena meditation techniques to quiet her own emotions so she could perceive others more clearly, showed her how to distinguish between different types of deception and shades of truth. The training was exhausting, but fascinating, and it gave Lena yet another way to be useful in Darius's complicated quest to reform the kingdom without destroying it in the process. She started sitting in on interrogations and negotiations, providing Darius with silent signals about whether people were being honest. The information proved invaluable, helping Darius identify genuine allies versus opportunists, exposing corruption that had been hidden for years, preventing several plots before they could come to fruition. But the heightened ability also meant Lena could sense things about Darius himself, could feel the complex tangle of emotions he worked so hard to keep hidden. She knew he cared about her beyond her usefulness, could sense the way his attention sharpened when she entered a room, the way something in him relaxed when they were alone together. She tried not to think too hard about what that meant, tried to maintain the professional distance that seemed safest given the massive power imbalance between them. But it was getting harder to ignore the way her own feelings were evolving, the way she looked forward to their evening meetings more than anything. Else in her day, the way her heart did stupid things when he smiled at her like she'd said something clever or insightful. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was just confused because he'd saved her and given her purpose and treated her like she mattered. But her truth sense, turned inward, told her she was lying to herself. The situation came to a head 3 months after that night in the ballroom. Darius had been dealing with increasing resistance from a coalition of noble families who objected to his reforms, particularly to Lena's visible role in his government. They'd been making noise about tradition and proper hierarchy, about how the king's obvious favor toward an Omega advisor was setting a dangerous precedent. Things escalated when Lord Varnish, one of the most powerful alphas in the kingdom, demanded a formal audience to discuss what he called the king's concerning choices. Darius granted the meeting, but insisted Lena be present, which only inflamed tensions further. Varnish arrived with a delegation of 5 other lords, all looking like they'd rather be executing a rebellion than having a conversation. The meeting took place in the throne room rather than the private study, a calculated choice on Darius's part to remind everyone exactly who held ultimate authority. Varnish didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your Majesty, we come to you out of concern for the kingdom and for your legacy. The changes you've been implementing, while well-intentioned, threaten to undermine the very structures that maintain order and stability. Granting an Omega such unprecedented access and authority sends a message that our traditional hierarchy is negotiable, which invites chaos and challenges to legitimate authority. We respectfully request that you reconsider these experimental policies before they do permanent damage to the kingdom's social fabric." The words were carefully chosen, phrased as concern rather than criticism. But Lena's truth sense picked up. the anger and contempt beneath the diplomatic language. Varnish didn't care about the kingdom. He cared about maintaining his own power and the privileges that came with his position at the top of the hierarchy. Darius leaned back in his throne, his expression giving away nothing. "Tell me, Lord Varnish, what specific damages have resulted from my experimental policies? Have tax revenues decreased? Have crime rates increased? Has our military strength been compromised? Have our trade relationships deteriorated? I'm curious about these permanent damages you're concerned about, so please enumerate them for me." Varnish's jaw tightened, clearly not expecting to have to provide evidence for his claims. "The damages to our social order, Your Majesty. When you elevate someone beyond their natural station, you suggest that the designations we're born with are meaningless. You encourage discontent among those who should accept their roles in society. You create unrealistic expectations that lead to disappointment and resentment. Surely you can see how this threatens stability." Darius stood, and the movement drew every eye in the room. He descended from the throne platform slowly, deliberately, until he was standing level with the delegation. "What I see, Lord Varnish, is that you've mistaken stability for stagnation. You've confused social order with oppression. The hierarchy you're so desperate to maintain has been failing for generations. Productivity among Omegas is abysmal because they're given no incentive to excel. Beta loyalty is questionable because they see how little their contributions are valued. Even alphas suffer under this system because they're raised to believe dominance is more important than competence. We've built a society where people are judged entirely by factors outside their control, rather than by their actual capabilities. That's not just morally bankrupt, it's strategically idiotic." He gestured toward Lena, who stood beside the throne, trying to look confident despite the 6 hostile alphas glaring at her. "Miss Harper has provided me with insights and information that none of you, with all your breeding and status, ever thought to offer. She's identified inefficiencies in our supply chains that saved the kingdom thousands in wasted resources. She's helped mediate disputes that would have resulted in violence. She's demonstrated intelligence and competence that put half my noble advisors to shame. So tell me, Lord Varnish, why should I value your opinion about hierarchy over the concrete results I've seen from treating people as individuals rather than categories?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Lena felt the tension in the room spike to dangerous levels. Varnish's face had gone red with barely controlled fury. "Because tradition and blood matter," he said, his voice tight. "Because without structure and hierarchy, we're no better than humans. Because some of us understand what it means to lead while others should follow." The truth sense hit Lena like a wave, and for a moment she saw behind Varnish's words to the real fear driving him. He wasn't afraid of social change or chaos. He was afraid of being revealed as mediocre, of having his incompetence exposed if the system that protected him disappeared. He knew that in a meritocracy, he'd lose the power and respect he'd done nothing to earn beyond being born to the right family. Before she could think better of it, before she could consider the consequences, Lena spoke. "You're not afraid of chaos, Lord Varnish. You're afraid of being judged on your actual merits and being found wanting. You've spent your entire life relying on a system that grants you status, regardless of whether you've earned it, and the idea that people might see through that terrifies you. Every head in the room turned to stare at her, and Lena realized she'd just committed what was probably a fatal social error. You didn't contradict a noble. Lord, you certainly didn't call one out publicly for cowardice and incompetence. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, while Varnish's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. How dare you? He finally choked out. You have no right to address me, much less to make such accusations. You're nothing but an Omega servant playing at being important because the king has taken pity on you. Your very presence here is an insult to everyone who's actually earned their position through blood and breeding. Darius moved before anyone else could react, positioning himself between Lena and Varnish with a speed that made several of the other lords take an involuntary step backward. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Darius's alpha power flooded the space in a wave of dominance that made even Lena's knees weak. She has every right because I've given it to her, Darius said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper that was somehow more terrifying. Then a shout. And she's not wrong, is she? You've been coasting on your family name and your designation your entire life. Your lands are poorly managed. Your people are miserable. Your contribution to the kingdom's welfare is negligible at best. The only thing you've actually earned is a reputation for arrogance and a talent for complaining whenever someone suggests you should have to demonstrate actual competence. Varnish looked like he might actually attack, his hands clenching into fists as his own alpha power rose to challenge Darius's. For a horrible moment, Lena thought she was about to witness a dominance battle that would leave half the throne room destroyed. Then Varnish seemed to register exactly who he was challenging, seemed to remember that Darius hadn't become Alpha King through political maneuvering alone, but through being the most dangerous wolf in the kingdom by a significant margin. The fight went out of him all at once, his shoulders slumping as he took several. Steps backward. "My apologies, Your Majesty," he said, the words clearly costing him. "I spoke in anger. But please understand that many of your nobles share my concerns, even if we may have expressed them poorly. These changes you're making, they frighten people who've lived their entire lives knowing what the rules are and how society functions." Darius's expression softened slightly, though his power didn't diminish. "I understand that change is frightening," he said. "I understand that asking people to rethink beliefs they've held for generations feels threatening. But fear of change doesn't justify maintaining systems that harm people. Your concerns are noted, Lord Varnish, but my decision stands. Miss Harper's position is not up for debate. The reforms will continue. If you and your fellow lords cannot accept that, you're welcome to withdraw from court. But if you choose to stay, you will treat her and everyone else in this palace with the respect they deserve as valued members of this kingdom. Is that clear?" It wasn't really a question. Varnish bowed stiffly, and his delegation followed suit. Then they filed out of the throne room with as much dignity as they could salvage. When they were gone, Darius turned to Lena with an expression that was equal parts concern and admiration. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said quietly. "Probably both. Are you all right?" Lena was shaking, adrenaline flooding her system as she realized how badly that could have gone. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have spoken. It wasn't my place, and I just made things harder for you. Darius shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You spoke truth when everyone else was dancing around it. That's exactly why I need you here. But Lena, you need to understand something. The nobles who oppose these changes aren't going to give up. They're going to see you as the symbol of everything they hate about what I'm doing, and they're going to come after you. If not physically, then through rumor and social destruction. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I need to know that you're prepared for that you're willing to stay even when things get difficult. Lena met his eyes, and for the first time since that night in the ballroom, she felt like they were truly seeing each other without barriers or pretense. I'm willing, she said simply. Whatever comes, I'm willing to face it, because what we're trying to do matters more than my comfort or safety. She saw something shift in his expression, saw the moment when professional distance transformed into something more personal and infinitely more complicated. Lena, he said, her name carrying weight that made her breath catch. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago but couldn't figure out how. That night in the ballroom, when I saw you, when our eyes met, I felt something I never expected to feel. The mate bond. You're my fated mate, Lena Harper. Wolf recognized you instantly, claimed you before I even knew your name. Everything I've done since then, every choice I've made regarding you, has been colored by that knowledge. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mate bonds were rare, precious, the kind of thing that happened in stories rather than real life. Lena had certainly never imagined that someone like her could be fated to someone like Darius. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth sense, which she'd been unconsciously monitoring, suddenly made sense of things she'd been feeling but couldn't name. The pull she felt toward him, the way her wolf responded to his presence, the sense that they fit together in ways that transcended logic. It hadn't been one-sided at all. She'd been feeling the bond too, had just been too inexperienced to recognize it for what it was. But recognizing it and accepting it were two different things. I don't understand, she said finally. If you knew we were mates, why didn't you tell me? Why go through all of this? The advisor position, the training, the political maneuvering. You could have just claimed me. As your mate, I would have had automatic status and protection. You could have avoided all the controversy and resistance. Darius's expression turned rueful. Because that would have made you mine without giving you any choice in the matter. The mate bond is powerful, Lena, but it doesn't automatically create the relationship it's meant to represent. I've seen forced matings destroy people, seen partners who resented being bound by biology rather than choice. I wanted you to have time to know me as a person, rather than as your fated mate. I wanted you to have the space to develop your own identity and power before binding yourself to me. I wanted our bond, if and when you chose to accept it, to be based on genuine connection, rather than obligation or biology. The admission took Lena's breath away. In a world where alphas routinely claimed their mates without consent, where the bond was considered sufficient justification for possession, Darius had chosen to give her agency. Had chosen to let her see him clearly, to develop her own strength, to make her decision from a position of power rather than vulnerability. It was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her, precisely because it wasn't romantic at all. It was respectful. It treated her as an equal partner rather than a prize to be claimed. Tears sprang to her. Eyes, and she didn't bother trying to hide them. "You incredible idiot," she said, her voice breaking on something between a laugh and a sob. "Do you have any idea how much harder you made this for yourself? How much easier everything would have been if you'd just claimed me that first night?" Darius closed the distance between them, reaching out to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "Easier doesn't mean better," he said softly. "You deserve better than easy, Lena. You deserve someone who sees you as a partner rather than a possession. Someone who values your mind and strength as much as the bond between us. I would have waited years if that's what you needed to be sure." So she kissed him, rising up on her toes to close the remaining distance, and felt the mate bond snap into place with a force that left them both gasping. It was like coming home and starting an adventure at the same time, like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. The bond sang between them a connection that transcended physical space and would let them sense each other's emotions and well-being regardless of distance. It would grow stronger over time, would become the foundation of a partnership that could weather anything life threw at them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Darius rested his forehead against hers. "This is going to make the political situation even more complicated," he said. "A mate bond between an Alpha King and an Omega advisor is going to be scandalous and controversial and probably give half my council actual heart attacks." Lena laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. "Good," she said. "Let them have heart attacks. We've already disrupted their comfortable little hierarchy. We might as well commit to it completely. Besides, I'm done making my life smaller to avoid making other people uncomfortable. If they can't handle the fact that we're mates, that's their problem to solve, not ours. The remaining months of that first year were turbulent in ways both challenging and transforming. The revelation of the mate bond between Darius and Lena sent shockwaves through every level of society. Some saw it as a hopeful sign that the rigid hierarchies might be softening. Others viewed it as a disaster that threatened the natural order. There were protests, petitions, and several attempted challenges to Darius's authority from lords who thought his choice of mate proved he'd gone soft. Each challenge was met with the same combination of strategic brilliance and overwhelming force that had made Darius Alpha King in the first place. But now, there was a new element. Lena, with her truth sense and political instincts, helped him identify the real threats versus the performative objections, helped him understand which nobles needed to be crushed, and which could be won over with the right approach. Together they made a formidable team. Darius provided the authority and power to implement change. Lena provided the insight to know what changes would actually work versus what would just create new problems. They reformed the legal system to provide better protections for omegas and betas, restructured the economy to reward merit rather than bloodline, and began the long process of dismantling social structures that had oppressed people for generations. It wasn't easy. Every change was fought tooth and nail by those who benefited from the old ways. But slowly, incrementally, the kingdom began to transform. Lena discovered that being queen, because that's what she was now whether or not they'd had a formal ceremony, was both harder and more rewarding than she'd imagined. She had influence, but also responsibility. She had power, but also constant scrutiny from people looking for any excuse to discredit her. She made mistakes, said the wrong things, pushed too hard on changes that weren't ready, and had to learn from each failure. But she also had victories, moments where she saw real change. Happening, where someone who would have been overlooked in the old system got an opportunity they'd earned, where justice actually served justice rather than reinforcing power. And through it all, she had Darius, her mate and partner, and the person who somehow saw her most clearly, even when she couldn't see herself. Their bond deepened in ways that went beyond the physical and romantic, though those elements were certainly present and powerful. They became true partners, each filling gaps in the other's understanding, each providing strength where the other had weakness. Darius helped Lena develop confidence and authority, taught her how to command a room and make people listen even when they didn't want to. Lena helped Darius reconnect with the compassion and idealism that had been buried under years of hard choices and necessary cruelty. Together they were greater than the sum of their parts, and the kingdom slowly began to recognize that truth. The story of the Alpha King who bowed to an Omega servant became legend, told in taverns and noble houses, in servant quarters and throne rooms. Some versions painted it as a romance, others as a political calculation, still others as evidence of changing times. What mattered was that it gave people permission to imagine different futures, to question hierarchies they'd accepted as natural and inevitable. Change came slowly, frustratingly slowly, but it came. Children born in the new era would grow up in a world where designation didn't determine destiny, where capability mattered more than bloodline, where an Omega could stand beside an Alpha as an equal, rather than a subordinate. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the kingdom, they would point to that night in the ballroom as the turning point. The moment when one woman's humiliation became the catalyst for revolution, when one Alpha's compassion revealed the possibility of a different kind of strength. They would analyze the political and social forces at play, the economic pressures that made change inevitable, the leadership decisions that shaped outcomes. But they would miss the most important part of the story, the thing that made everything else possible. They would miss the simple truth that sometimes changing the world starts with one person seeing another person's humanity and choosing to honor it, even when everyone around them says it doesn't matter. They would miss the love story at the heart of the political. Transformation. The mate bond that wasn't just about destiny, but about choice. About two people deciding that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. Lena stood on the balcony of the palace, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and rose, and felt Darius's arms wrap around her from behind. They'd been mates for 5 years now, long enough that the bond felt as natural as breathing, but every morning she still marveled at how far they'd come from that horrible, night in the ballroom. "What are you thinking about?" Darius murmured against her hair, and through the bond she could feel his contentment, his peace, his absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. "I'm thinking about how much courage it must have taken for you to bow that night," she said. How you risked everything, your authority, your reputation, the stability you'd worked so hard to maintain, all for someone you didn't even know. I'm thinking about how one moment of compassion changed everything, not just for us, but for the entire kingdom. Darius tightened his arms around her, and she felt his love wash through the bond like a physical thing. I didn't risk everything for someone I didn't know, he corrected gently. I risked everything because my wolf recognized you, and my heart knew what my mind hadn't figured out yet, that you were worth any risk, worth any sacrifice, worth fighting the entire world if that's what it took. The best decision I ever made was. Putting that cloak around your shoulders and showing everyone in that room that you mattered. Not because of what it started politically, though I'm proud of that too, but because it gave me you, and you've made me better than I ever could have been alone. They stood together as the sun rose higher, two people from impossibly different worlds who'd found each other in the unlikeliest way and built something that neither could have created separately. And if anyone asked them for advice about changing the world or fighting injustice or building a better society, they would say this. Start by seeing people, really seeing them, not as categories or designations or statistics, but as individuals with inherent worth and dignity. And when you see someone being treated as less than human, have the courage to step forward, to offer your protection, to demonstrate through action that their humanity matters. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures, a cloak offered at the right moment, a bow, that breaks every rule, a decision to treat someone with dignity when everyone else is laughing. Those are the things that change history. Not through grand declarations or sweeping reforms, though those have their place, but through the simple revolutionary act of recognizing that every person deserves respect, and then having the courage to act on that recognition, regardless of the cost. The kingdom they'd built together wasn't perfect. Prejudices didn't disappear overnight, and centuries of hierarchy couldn't be dismantled in a few years. There was still work to do, still battles to fight, still people who needed protection and systems that needed reform. But the foundation had shifted. The possibility of change had been demonstrated. And in palaces and servant quarters, in noble houses and common taverns, people were beginning to imagine different futures where your designation didn't determine your destiny, where strength came in forms beyond physical dominance, where an omega could stand equal to an alpha and be recognized for the power she carried within. And it all started with a laugh, a torn dress, and an alpha king who chose compassion over convenience, who saw a person where others saw only a designation, who had the courage to bow when everyone expected him to look away. That single choice rippled outward through time and space, through hearts and minds, through policies and laws, until the kingdom itself was transformed. Not because change was easy, but because two people decided it was necessary and were willing to fight for it together. That's the power of witnessing someone's humanity and choosing to honor it. That's the revolution that starts with seeing and proceeds through courage and transforms the world, one choice, one gesture, one act of radical compassion at a time. Thank you so much for watching this complete story. If you enjoyed this supernatural romance, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales. of love, power, and transformation. What did you think of Darius and Lena's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your reactions and theories. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is recognize someone's worth when the rest of the world refuses to see it.